All right. Guess we might as well get started. Yeah, so I'm Peter Todd. I've been involved in, Bitcoin development or related things for, over 10 years now. But for Bitcoin Core, I've done some coding work, but most of what I've done is like analysis around protocols and so on. And this particular thing is, really relevant to like layer 2 protocols and things like that. And I'm kind of curious, like in the audience, does anyone actually, does anyone work as a developer on these kind of things? Like Lightning? Yeah. All right, but you know some programming stuff at least, so that's a good start. Yeah. Well, some people here might know even more than me. Let's see how many eggs I get thrown at me for it. But I'll go start at the very beginning, which of course is come on. There we go. The year of full mempools. And it'd probably exactly a year to this day or roughly that all this ordinal madness started. And if you go look at that wonderful graph, that is the past year. And sure enough, that's soon after the mempools start getting bigger. And for the people who are maybe a little less familiar, I mean, when I say the mempools, you got to remember, like every Bitcoin node, of course, has its own internal mempool. And a key thing about them is that they're limited in size and that it's effectively like an auction system. People are bidding for block space, right? They're attaching fees to transactions. They propagate around the network. Mempools have a certain size by default, so you can compute like what's the lowest fee something can get in, and also compute like what's the upper range of those fees. But long story short is like what all this means is transactions can sit around in mempools for a very long time. And, here's this transaction I just randomly looked up on mempool.space and first seen 1 month ago. And, that's a transaction that was quite a large one, but, paid 100, is attempting to pay $136 worth of Bitcoin and fees at 23 sats per VByte. Now, keep in mind that like a year ago, 1 sat per VByte would have been enough to get your transaction mined within 10 minutes pretty reliably. So because of ordinals and because of other things in the economics, we've seen a very big change in kind of what Bitcoin looks like. Now, it's not the first time this has happened. If you actually, a lot of people forget this. Like we've seen other big fee spikes before, and in fact, the intensity of the fee spike this time around isn't actually as intense as the peaks in prior fee spikes. But I think for whatever reason, this has kind of captured the attention the most. And part of that's probably just that the minimum mempool fee has gone up so much. And this causes a bunch of problems. But, the solution is supposed to be fee bumping, right? And this happens to be a screenshot from Phoenix. Phoenix actually uses child pays for parent fee bumping. There's also RBF fee bumping, but, there's some technical details. But the important thing to think there is, well, you're offering more money, right? Like you're offering more money to miners to get your transaction mined. And for the most part, with single user wallets, these mechanisms work pretty well. There are some little exceptions, but, as long as you're willing to go pay the money and have a wallet that doesn't suck, like we've kind of solved a lot of these problems. And frankly, some of that's been work, I've campaigned on for like 10 years now, which just get replaced by fee implemented. And, that all happened, wallet supported, and for the most part that works. But there's a catch, which is multi-party transactions. And here's Alice and Bob, the heroes of all of our cryptography. As you can see, Alice is the one who's kind of crazy, and Bob probably smokes pot. And then there's Mallory, who's hiding off in the shadows somewhere, waiting to sneak out and do something malicious. But, in this case, I mean, let's go assume that Alice and Bob are doing a coin join. Something very benign and lovely. And I want to start with this example of a multi-party transaction because it's pretty much one of the simplest cases I can get that's obvious. What's a coin join? Well, Alice and Bob get their coins together, put them into one transaction. You have, transaction in, transaction outs. And from the point of view of an external observer who can't read the text, now you have some more anonymity. All well and good. So, what could go wrong here? Okay, well, that could definitely be a problem. Can you think of something else Bob could go do? Could you think of something else Bob could go do? Or even unintentional stuff? Okay, yeah, so Bob could double spend input. Well, what do you know? Good prediction. So let's suppose Bob double spends an input. Well, what's going to happen? Now, these are unconfirmed transactions. So, of course, only one can get into the block eventually. But, like, what are our possible scenarios here? Right? What transactions could be mined? Well, maybe, maybe not. I mean,
If Bob wants to be malicious and he knows the first transaction is going to take a long time, he can just spend all of his money immediately.
yeah, okay. Or, I mean, I should point out, like, Bob may not be malicious here. I mean, this could have just happened because Bob was running, like, 2 copies of Wasabi Wallet on different computers by accident, or, like, some other glitch. But certainly, yeah, you could have a double spend that way. Although, maybe let's go and think, like, if Bob's double spend goes through and gets mined, is that really so bad? Yeah. So actually, that's not so bad. Similarly, if Alice's goes through from the point of view of whoever Bob is sending money to, yeah, their unconfirmed transaction might get canceled, but that's not really a big problem. However, this is kind of something I want to go and point out. Like, in both these cases, something happens quickly, right? Something got mined, so the protocol could make forward progress. And I should point out, like, with Wasabi Wallet, this is CoinJoin with, like, 2 people in it. But with Wasabi, there's, hundreds of people per transaction. And in Wasabi, it's a multi-stage protocol. So very, very frequently, someone in those hundreds of people doesn't actually complete the round, and the round fails, and you go move on. So, but, these are automated systems, so you just let it keep on chugging away, and eventually it works. But what Bob could do is make a double spend that's very low fee. And I think you're already kind of touching on this, which, we do have replaced by fee, which certainly does help this. And replaced by fee, roughly speaking, the rule is pay more money, and you get your transaction mined first. Right? Seems simple enough. We'll get into a second and why it's not quite as simple as it sounds. But for CoinJoin, at least, for a lot of these cases, the other part of the problem that solved it was full RBF. Now, with replaced by fee, and I'm risking a little off topic here, but you can go turn it off according to Bitcoin Core BIP-125. And it's like a little, roughly speaking, a bit in the transaction. And if you turn it off, your transaction isn't replaceable. I could give a whole 30-minute talk on this bullshit, but long pile of political nonsense that... Anyway, we can fix this aspect now with something called Mempool full RBF. In fact, I should be wearing my full RBF hat. But, set that in your bitcoin.conf and we'll solve this side of the problem. And, at least for the level of discussion we've had here, right? Mempool full RBF means that whichever pays a higher fee is going to get in first, and if someone pays a reasonably high fee, one of these transactions is going to get mined, and people can make forward progress, right? That sounds all good in theory, and what do miners do? Well, there's an example of mempool.space block, and obviously they're going to order that by fee rate. In this particular graphic, the red stuff at the bottom is the highest fee transactions. Other ones are bigger, or lower fee. But something else I want to go point out with, which we'll get into soon, is notice the difference in size of transactions, like the bytes they take up. Because Bitcoin Core, the standardness rules allow you to have anywhere from like essentially 0 to 100,000 V bytes. There's a very big range for how big a transaction is. And, when we go talk about, like, pay a higher fee, well, what does that really mean? And, if you go on, say, mempool.space and look at their transaction replacement, listing, and look at, their logs of this, well, notice how they're quoting replacements in terms of sats per vbyte. That is the rate of fee they pay. How much money a transaction bids for how many bytes of space. Now, can someone see how that might be a little incompatible with just, like, pay more? Well, go on to my next slide. So, getting a little bit more technical. This is BIP-125 replaced by fee. This is one of the rules that's actually implemented in Bitcoin Core. And this rule says the replacement transaction, and I should clarify, like, these are the rules that allow a replacement transaction to happen. Of course, well, we kind of said, oh yeah, it pays more. We got to get a little more nuanced. And the rule that's implemented is a replacement transaction has to pay a fee of at least the sum paid by the replaced transactions. Well, remember I was pointing out how transactions could be really big? What if that's what our coin join looks like? And the double spend is really big. In fact, this diagram isn't even remotely to scale, because the difference between, like, a 2 input, 2 output and the biggest possible transaction that meets the standardness rules is something like, would it be if not mistaken, a 500x increase. And, well, my screen's not big enough to show 500x. Well, so what does this mean? Well, let's suppose that, right now, like, the minimum fee to get into Mempools is roughly 20 sats per vbyte. The fee required to get into the next block earlier today was like 25 sats per vbyte. Now, that's an unusually small range, but in this particular case, Bob could double spend with a very big transaction paying 20 sats per vbyte, a transaction that isn't going to get mined maybe ever. And now Alice, how is Alice going to pay more money than Bob? Right? Like, Alice wanted to go pay, well, let's see, 25 sats per vbyte times 200. I don't know, it seems like a much smaller number than 25 sats times 200 seems a lot smaller number than 20 times, like, 100,000. But according to Rule 5, well, if Alice wants to outspend Bob, she has to go pay this entire massive amount of money. Yet Bob is probably never going to go pay that, because realistically Bob's transaction isn't actually going to get mined. Like, I don't think I have a great one. Well, yeah. So, like, yeah, this is a great example. Like, 20 sats per vbyte. That's like here on that graph. And, you'd be waiting like a month. And chances are if Bob wants to do something clever, Bob can figure out a way to get his transaction double spent once he's finished pissing off Alice. Like, there are lots of ways to avoid these rules. But, Alice's software is probably not going to go do that. And Alice's will just go sit there wondering, well, why is my transaction getting mined? And, furthermore, like, the way these rules are written, let's suppose Alice wants to get her money unstuck. Like, she can't even double spend one of her own inputs, because it still winds up conflicting in a lot of cases. So there isn't good answers there.
When Bob releases a big transaction, the Mempools that accept the big transaction, they remove the previous
Well, yeah. Well, that's the problem is, of course, you're correct, but the Mempools that do this, like, it's likely that Alice's mempool will not necessarily notice this in a lot of circumstances. In one of the reasons why this can happen is that there's another rule, which isn't actually even in the BIP-125 standard. It's colloquially call it Rule 6, which says that the fee rate can't be decreased. So depending on the exact timing, like, Alice's transaction can get in, and then kind of sit there, and then Bob's transaction can also get in and kind of sit there, depending on the exact ordering. Like it's an ugly problem. And without writing more complex software, there isn't necessarily a good way to go fix this, right? Like you could imagine like a phone wallet where the wallet doesn't really have a proper understanding of what's going on in mempools, and these things kind of happen, and there aren't good ways to fix it. But keep in mind, so I use CoinJoin as an example. There are much worse examples out there. Lightning, certain ways you can implement Lightning are vulnerable to this kind of thing, and the reason why really comes down to the fact that in Lightning you need things to happen on a deadline, all right? Like, let's suppose Alice and Bob had a Lightning channel set up, and Alice wants to go screw over Bob by trying to go and get his channel stuck to the point where he gives up and maybe goes offline for a while. All Alice has to do is find a way to create one of these, pinned transactions that are stuck, and then just let Bob, wait for something to go happen. And, maybe Alice will notice Bob's gone offline, and then Alice can try to then go steal from Bob, right? Like, there's tons of nuances here, but I think the important thing is, the fact this can happen at all is a major problem. It screws with our conceptions of, how Bitcoin's supposed to work. Software kind of is written to assume, well, obviously, mempool, fees can go up, right? There can be high demand. You might have to go outbid other people. But at least it should be possible to outbid other people in a reasonable way. And transaction pinning, especially Rule 3 transaction pinning, screws this up. And of the, there's a lot of types of transaction pinning, but the type that's most unfixable so far has been this Rule 3 one. And then next thing I want to go is show, well, what other work has been done on this? And from the point of view of big picture work, like changes to Bitcoin Core that could work for all protocols, the big solution people are looking at is called V3 transactions. And, my one-line summary basically sums it up. It says you're no longer allowed to have a large child transaction spending a parent. Now, interestingly, this doesn't actually solve the CoinJoin problem, but it can solve this issue to some extent for Lightning transactions, where a lot of Lightning usage is, again, remember, Alice, Bob, and Lightning channel, they have their funds in basically a 2 of 2 multisig. So for things to happen in the Lightning channel, that 2 of 2 multisig has to get spent, and it has to get spent in ways depending on how the state of the channel is evolving. Well, one way you can go deal with this is if you only want to go sign one transaction, roughly speaking, per state of the channel, well, how do you go and pay fees? Right? Are you going to pre-sign every single possible fee variant? You can, actually. It's not that unreasonable. But Lightning chose not to do that. Instead, Lightning chose, well, why don't we go and put all the fee paying into other transactions? All right? So take your transaction that actually advances the state of Lightning channel forward, then you spend an output of it, and you use a child pays for parent mechanism, right? The child transaction pays a fee, enough of a fee to kind of tell miners, hey, you should mine this parent transaction so that you can then collect the fee from the child. Hence, child pays for parent. Well, V3 transaction is designed to make that mechanism not pinnable by saying that the child must be small, right? Now remember, this whole pinning discussion with Rule 3 came about because transactions could be really big, right? If all transactions were the same size, there would be no difference between fee and fee rate, right? They would essentially be the same thing. But because they're not the same size, that's where all this sort of economics comes into play. I mean, a simple way to think about it is miners, of course, are producing a supply of something. So it's kind of akin to, you're running an apple orchard, and you get apples every once in a while. And for some reason, certain customers go say, well, you know what? I'm only going to go buy 100,000 apples from you, and here's the price per apple. Whereas other customers are quite happy to go buy one. And the way Bitcoin Core works is it's as though you go and allow these big bids, not necessarily a very high price, to go and dominate like how you go sell your apples. Now, it sounds a little ridiculous for an orchard to do this, but there's better reasons in Bitcoin Core. But, that is how it is. Now, can you think of a better way? I mean, like, what if you're a miner and you have a transaction that pays low fee, but it's enormous? And then you learn about a transaction that pays a high fee rate, but a low total fee compared to the big fee rate transaction. Like, what do you think you should do? All right? You can get money right now, right, at the top of your block. Like, let's go back a second. Remember, that's a block being built, right? Well, okay, in this case, it's a block that was built. But you can imagine, like, you're a miner. Your software is constantly, within that space allotable, constantly trying to pack in the most fee-paying transactions, right? You're going to pack those fee-paying transactions in on order of fee rate. What transaction pays the most money per byte? That's how you maximize your revenue for the limited space you have. Now, in this picture, if that's a block, you can imagine way up on the screen, way beyond where your block actually is. That's the low fee transaction, right? You have a copy of that low fee transaction, but you're probably not going to actually mine it, like, for maybe another month, if ever. I mean, there's no guarantee an unconfirmed transaction will ever be mined, right? Someone could double spend it and get it mined some other way. So the question is, you learn about a high fee rate transaction. A transaction would go all the way to the bottom of the mempool here and immediately get mined. Do you accept it or do you reject it? You can have your money, in 10 minutes. Well, I propose that miners should accept it, because that's how you get more revenue now. And I can't, like, I have a blog post on this stuff where I kind of go into better mathematical detail, and it's very hard to conceptualize what is the expected return of the transaction, like what really makes you get more money. Now, obviously, there can be circumstances where, like, somehow, like, 20 blocks are found in the next 10 seconds due to incredibly good luck, right? Maybe in that case, this low-fee transaction does get mined and does earn you revenue. But that's not very likely to happen. It's much more likely that by accepting the high-fee rate transaction, you're going to earn more money now. Well, if you accept the high-fee rate transaction, that fixes transaction pinning, because now whoever spends more fee rate, their transaction will get mined next, right? In our example of, this huge transaction, whichever one paid the most fee rate, it'll just get mined next, and the protocol will make forward progress. So, all right. So, why hasn't this already been implemented? I mean, I'm the guy who came up with the replace by fee rules in the first place. I'm the one responsible for this. Well, when we did this 8 years ago, one issue was if you just do replace by fee rate, well, what if someone broadcasts a really big transaction and then a small transaction and they replace them over and over again, right? That'll allow someone to use up a lot of relay bandwidth, the bandwidth we need for communicating transactions around, and not pay very much for it. And the ratio of that, you can do the math on, it's roughly 4,000x, right? So it's 4,000 times cheaper. Now, I don't have time to go into the details, but basically my argument now is, look, now that fees are high, relay bandwidth is so expensive, nobody's going to actually attack that way. But more recently, I came up with a better solution, which is, what? Why don't we just do replace by fee rate if the fee rate is enough to get into the next block? Right? And again, going back to our miner learns about a transaction that's going to get mined in the next block. Well, why not just make that the rule? If it's going to be mined in the next block and the previous one wouldn't, do replace by fee rate. It's not always perfect in terms of miners making more money, but it makes sense nearly all the time, and it fixes transaction pinning. And the only challenge we really have at this point is, well, someone's actually got to write the code. And turns out writing that code is kind of annoying because of how the Bitcoin mempool is implemented. There's no easy way to just ask the data structure that implements it, hey, what is the fee rate necessary to get into the next block? You laugh, but like that is actually the biggest obstacle right now. There are hacks around it, but in the meantime, what I've done is I've created something called Bitcoin Libra Relay, which I created for entirely different reasons, to go like remove the op return rules and basically show that like filtering ordinals is a bad idea. But something I did do is I threw in replace by fee rate too. Funny enough, and of course this shows about implementation, I've managed to go screw up my implementation of it twice now and allow one of these DOS attacks. And in this case, it's actually a cycle where you can replace a transaction in like a one after another infinitely. And I don't have enough time to go into the details, but basically why that's possible is that Bitcoin Core's replaced by fee rules are kind of broken in that they'll actually allow a transaction be replaced by a less desirable transaction right now. Right? So your like fee rate can actually go down. And this Rule 6 I mentioned earlier is trying to go prevent this, but long story short, it's not perfect, and that needs to be fixed. But provided I can come up with a reasonable solution there, I think we actually do have, a reasonable replaced by fee rate implementation possible, and in the future, a one-shot replaced by fee rate. And what this means for protocols like Lightning and CoinJoy and so on is we have a pretty easy way to fix transaction pinning. And you don't need to like add special transaction versions or special